So, you want to animate for a map. Stay tuned, folks. Hello and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm your host, Spirit, and today I'll be sharing my experiences with making a part for a multi-animator project, aka a map, as well as some of the general things I learned about animation in the process. So, what is a map? Well, a multi-animator project is a project where a bunch of animators will get together and create short animated clips to be featured in one longer project. The major advantage to making maps is that you're able to create short, completed products that can be really high in detail, rather than having to worry about an entire project by yourself. Given that things like detailed shading and more realistic anatomy tend to be really time-consuming, a lot of animators will often opt for simplified designs and styles. Not saying that simplifying is bad, of course, but it is nice to have some variety in execution if that makes sense. When I heard about the Sticky Bee map, I was initially nervous about applying because I'm not really super practiced as an animator. Sure, I have a general understanding of how it works and I'm pretty practiced at drawing, but at the same time, I've never really created an animation for an official project like a map. I really liked the Fly Away map that Crown originally hosted, and so I decided, what the heck, I'll apply and see what happens. Turns out I got in, and yeah, that was a bit of a panic moment considering my channel doesn't really feature too much animation. As soon as I heard the song, I already knew what I wanted to do. I have an original character named Kevin who is from an original superhero project of mine. He's very much inspired by rock, more specifically hard rock and some punk rock. I've always had a soft spot for bands like Green Day. Punk rock and hard rock are genres that I feel have a lot more grit to them than some current modern pop songs. Songs like American Idiot and Basket Case have a certain feeling to them which I feel a lot of modern music is sorely missing. I don't know, maybe I'm just a reverse hipster who listens to music before her time. I've noticed a lot of characters who are inspired by music will generally play an instrument pertaining to their music of choice, and this one is no different. I felt that having a character play an electric guitar would be a good fit for the music, though since the clip would have to be synced up with any part of the song, my original idea didn't end up working and I had to simplify it. My original idea for the animation was far more ambitious. Originally I was going to have my character play in sync with the frets, syncopate, and have the head bob on every third of every eighth note. I was also planning on having his hair have a bit more of a bob to it, allowing it to fall on the 4th note and bounce back up on the 5th and 6th note. However, when I thumbed out my idea in Flash, I realized that this simply wouldn't work for this type of map. After hours of listening to the song over and over, I realized that the bridge was actually different than the chorus when it came to subtempo, which, if my part was placed anywhere in the chorus, it really wouldn't have worked well. In hindsight, I really wish that I had saved my initial thumbnail concept, or at least recorded my process of making the animation. But since animation takes so much longer than just making a single image, I would have had hours of footage that wouldn't have been as interesting to watch because a lot of it was just drawing the same pieces over and over again. If I remember correctly, I think I made at least 3 passes before I could get everything to look somewhat on model. My original mentality with this animation was going to be focusing on detail over the amount of motion. Similar to anime, you'll often see little time-saving tricks like simply having a still frame over a moving background or reducing lip sync. A sort of Western counterpart in animation would be limited animation, where instead of drawing the entire character every single frame, you only redraw the part that's actually moving while keeping the rest of the frame static. This allows animators to save time since they don't have to redraw and recolor every single frame. Limited animation was really common in cell-based animation and is still used to some extent in most TV animation. I guess to some degree puppet animation might also count as limited animation since it uses similar principles, but that's out for debate. The total amount of time my portion of the animation took was about 16 hours of work, a majority of it spent drawing the assets. Initially, I started off with a basic sketch of the character in a fixed pose, then came back with a second detailed pass. When it came down to creating the pieces for animation, I made the main body along with the back arm, the guitar, the front arm, the back hand, the front arm, and the head all as separate areas. The only parts that aren't actually static are just the hand and the head, which I realized that after compositing made it appear a bit stiff, but there wasn't really much I could do at that point. An idea I had when it came to the guitar was I was going to have the strings actually vibrate when they were strummed. I even made a set of blurred strings that would arc and slowly return to the original position, but thanks to the brush I ended up using, it looked wrong and it didn't really come out how I envisioned it. Speaking of, let's talk about the actual process of making the animation. The animation itself was actually made in a variety of programs. Starting with the original thumbnail animation, which was basically just a series of about 8 rough drawings, gave me a general idea of where the character was, what the motion was intended to be, and the idea for the background. I did the thumbnail animation in Adobe Animate because being able to do instant playback is pretty essential for me to have an idea of what's going on. Most of the time, larger animation projects will have a storyboard or some kind of animatic. However, since this animation was going to be short, I felt that making a rough animation beforehand would really help me get a feel for the motion, since you can't really do a storyboard in a loop. Next, I went into Fire Alpaca and began to sketch out a more detailed version of the thumbnail. When doing the sketching portion of the animation, I worked at a 2560 by 1440 size canvas, which is just a little bit bigger than 1080p, so I was able to get in the right amount of detail for the first official pass of the character. After that, I increased the canvas size to 4000 pixels wide and came along for a second pass. This second pass allowed me to get a far more detailed version of what I was going to be drawing and allowed me to get a far more accurate representation of the character. After doing the refined second pass, I came over to Photoshop and began the third and final corrective pass. This part involved sketching out all the moving parts, such as the head, arm, and whatnot. The biggest thing I was going for was maintaining anatomical consistency, such as pieces of hair, earrings, broken eyebrow, etc. In cases like the head, what I did was make a base drawing of the head that had all the parts that would remain still, duplicated it, and added the changed parts to the head and the neck, and then labeled each with different colors. Next, using a textured brush in Photoshop, I manually inked each of the parts. A majority of my works are usually inked in Fire Alpaca with the standard hard brush. However, I wanted my animation to have a bit of a rougher, more organic feel to it. There are programs that allow textured brushes, however I don't have a license for them, nor am I really experienced enough with animation to justify having more than one program. As such, the time I would normally spend on doing line work was actually doubled because I didn't have the clean line work or any sort of correction tool like Fire Alpaca or Paint Tool Sai. This also of course requires me to manually color each of the pieces. Normally when I'm doing work in Fire Alpaca, I'll simply be able to select the color and use the paint bucket tool in the line work. But since this animation was comprised of a bunch of pieces and the line work wasn't solid enough for this technique, I had to color them manually. Admittedly, it was a little bit of a time sink, and there were times that I probably could have used to make this animation a lot faster. But in the end, I found that manually coloring was actually quite relaxing. It just allowed me to turn off my brain and go. When it comes to shading, I was originally going to do a textured cell shading style, have it be almost anime-esque but with the textured brush to make the edges more bumpy or almost sketchy in nature. However, after I tested this on the head, I realized it was a bit too inconsistent, causing this sort of flickering effect with the shadows. So instead what I did was I manually shaded each of the pieces with blue and applied a multiply effect before reducing the opacity. A lot of digital animators nowadays will often use plugins to shade their animations. Most often this is done in programs such as After Effects. I have After Effects, but in the end the only shading that I added that wasn't manually done was an inverted inner shadow, which was just a very light gray applied with the overlay effect. After I finished all the pieces, I exported the frames as individual files, imported them into Premiere, and began the compositing process, which is essentially when you take all the pieces and make the final product. I did end up making a second version of the animation with ghost frames because I felt it added a cool effect. The way I did this was I took the original completed clip, then staggered 3 duplicates by a difference of a couple frames. The duplicates each had different levels of opacity to them, with the closest one in time being around 60%, while the furthest behind was only 20%. If you would like to see my part as well as the rest of the map, I've linked it in the description as well as in the card. Crown's work is pretty great, and if you aren't somehow subbed to her, I would definitely check out her stuff. It's thanks to Scribblekibble that Artblock even exists. So yeah, if you're looking for something similar but with a higher production value, then Scribblekibble is definitely going to be your cup of tea. Before I go, I do want to talk a little bit about the background. I have a feeling a lot of people might be wondering how it was made since it doesn't really look like the stuff I've drawn before. Initially I was going to hand draw the entire background, but after spending so much time working on the actual animation process, I realized that for something on this scale, working for several more hours on a really highly detailed background was not going to be very intuitive. As an artist, you need to keep a balance between creating a product that you're satisfied with and making sure you don't spend too much time on one thing. As someone who does art commissions as their main job, I have to make sure that I'm balancing my time between personal projects and commission work. And given how time-consuming other things like YouTube and commission work are, I began to realize that I would need something fast that would be able to fit more with a detailed style. So, what's the secret? It's photo manipulation. Everything from the buildings, the window frames, and the bricks are all stock photos, all put through filters, color adjustments, and lighting effects to make them look like something that would fit in this scenario. I did end up spending a bit more time making the water, adding gradient overlays, and applying various ripple effects, but yeah, photo manipulation. And that is my behind-the-scenes process of making a part for a map. So, did you learn anything from this video? Are you an animator or work with maps? And if so, what's your experience? Tell me about it in the comments below. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And that's about it for today's show. If you liked what you saw and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It supports me and is practically free. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter and DeviantArt, where I post artwork and updates about the show. A big thank you to my patrons, such as Max Ogier and Mr. Eden, for supporting the show. If you would like to join them, the links to my Patreon and other pages are in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching, I'm Spirit, and I'll see you next time.